Hi, all. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar that we have with Access2Learn and NeuroElevate. Today we have Rachel from their team presenting for us today. And if you aren't aware of DAL, Dyslexia Association of London, that's the organization that I'm with, and we offer these free webinars on a monthly basis. And yeah, without further ado, I will let Rachel take over and talk to us all about the remote dyslexia assessments that her team offers.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Grace, and thanks everyone for coming along. So, yes, I'm Rachel and I'm a specialist dyslexia assessor working for an organisation that provides an holistic wraparound approach to disability assessments. So, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of that organisation because it is made up of those three enterprises that you can see before you. So, Access2Learn, Working Bright and NeuroElevate. So Access2Learn offers needs assessments for students at university, which basically means they discuss the challenges that a higher education setting might present in relation to disabilities, and then they'll provide individualised recommendations. Working Bright offers a similar needs assessment process for the workplace with the addition of strategy coaching as well. But it's all got to start somewhere, and that place is often the diagnostic assessment process, which is where NeuroElevate fits into that provision. So today I'm going to talk you through that specific aspects of the service, but even more specifically, remote dyslexia assessments. So I'm going to sort of focus on adults in this session. There are lots of parallels with children's provision as well, but today is going to be focused on adults. So by the end of the session, I'm hoping that you'll have a clear understanding of what a remote assessment involves, what makes what the different stages look like, what makes it appropriate for somebody or not appropriate. We're going to look at how an assessment can support people, specifically in the workplace, including how the report can be used to inform reasonable adjustments and how that might fit into the access to work process. So I'll also run through some of the frequently asked questions that crop up in relation to remote assessments. I have produced a frequently asked questions document that can be passed on to participants if you so wish later on, and there'll be some time at the end to answer questions as well. So the wider aim of the purpose of this is just to perhaps make you feel a bit more confident in deciding whether a remote assessment is the right choice for you or the person that you're supporting. So it's aimed at adults rather than children or families, and like I've said, there are many parallels. So if you're thinking about a dyslexia assessment for yourself, for somebody else, or just wanting to understand how this remote delivery works in practice, it's also useful if you're navigating dyslexia in the workplace, if you're an employer, HR professional, wellbeing lead, looking to understand how assessments can help you and assist you and link to reasonable adjustments and access to work. So hopefully a bit of a mix of audience and individuals, all with the same purpose. So initially, we've always got to start off with the definitions to sort of set the stall out. And as assessors, as professionals, when we're talking about dyslexia, we're usually referring to the shared and recently updated definition that's been agreed by experts, referred to as the Delphi definition. So just in everyday terms, when we're looking at dyslexia, we're looking at a difference in how the brain processes language, affecting how easily and fluently someone can read or spell. these difficulties are long-standing and they don't come from poor teaching or low ability. And often it's the case, many people with dyslexia have clear strengths in other areas, examples such as reasoning or creativity and problem solving. And it always exists on a continuum, which is really important when you going through the assessment process and writing reports, because everyone is different, and many people develop strategies that help them cope, even though reading and writing will still take much more effort. And the newer definition doesn't really change who counts as being dyslexic, if you like, but it explains dyslexia in a more up-to-date way. It's a lifelong pattern of processing difficulties that have an effect on reading and spelling, and make things much more effortful than what we'd expect for someone of a particular age or who've had particular opportunities, usually linked to phonological skills, working memory, processing speed. So for a diagnosis, that means assessors are not looking at low literacy scores, but at an overall pattern of strengths and challenges alongside an individual's history to judge whether dyslexia is actually the best explanation. So that just sets the stall out for that. So, before we look at remote assessments as well, it's useful to just have a quick pit stop at what is a dyslexia assessment, just a brief overview of that process. And I think, spoiler alert, what you're going to sort of see is there isn't much difference between a remote assessment and a face-to-face assessment. The process is the same. You will gather a really detailed history of an individual, including your school experiences, family history, health and developmental factors, your everyday functioning, and that can sometimes involve talking to family members and getting their input. You often find that individuals don't actually recall accurately that early experience as adults we're allowed to forget. So I think it's definitely beneficial to have discussions with wider friends and family during that process yourself when that information is being gathered. There's an exploration of strengths and challenges, and it's not all just about what's going wrong. It's an affirming process, this, and what you often observe as an assessor is a lot of resilience and implementation of strategies. So this process is all about really championing in those and bringing those to the forefront. And the next bit, the test bits, the perhaps the not so popular bits of standardized tests. So the standardized tests are tools that have been given to large groups of people in the same way. So we as assessors can know what a typical performance looks like for each age. And when you take a standardized test, your scores can be fairly compared with others of the same age. And that helps us see whether skills are within an expected range, whether they're a strength or whether they are an area of challenge. And these tests will typically look at receptive and expressive language, reading, spelling, writing, phonological skills, memory, attention and processing speed. So they are often areas that do present challenges, but you also do see, like I've said, a lot of those strengths emerging from those assessments. So it can be a really positive experience doing those assessments. There are some other tests that might be used, and that's at the discretion of the assessor, and it's really based on the individual being being assessed. So there's lots of opportunities to sort of pinpoint specific areas in an assessment according to the individual. So other areas might be reasoning ability, listening comprehension, mathematics, visual spatial processing as well. And like I've said, not just looking at one score, it's an overall pattern of strengths and challenges and how that lines up with our understanding of the Delphi definition of dyslexia. Um, so we're looking for those patterns, looking for things that might be unexpected, and the outcome ideally is a clear diagnostic decision where that is appropriate. A diagnosis sometimes doesn't occur, but where that decision is provided, and where it isn't, if a diagnostic decision isn't given, there are always sets of practical, tailored recommendations that you can actually use in an educational context, whether that's school, university, workplace, and home as well. So, in terms of remote assessments, then, why remote? I suppose a bit of a background in understanding how we've got to remote assessments would be beneficial. Um, and I think it's probably grown out of a mix of technology catching up, and necessity. And that's something quite relevant. I think today there was something on the news about by the end of this decade, Ofqual are hoping that children doing GCSEs will be doing digitised exams in certain subject areas. So there's a definite shift and requirements for the adoption of a digitized approach in lots of aspects of life. And dyslexia assessments is absolutely one of those things as well. Um, and it didn't just happen because of COVID. Before COVID, there were specialist teachers and psychologists already experimenting with online tools like video calls, computer-based tests, and online questionnaires. It was a bit niche, but in special circumstances, those did take place in that kind of capacity. But of course, because of COVID and lockdown and the ceasing of face-to-face work, it sort of accelerated that approach. People still needed diagnostic services and support, especially for things like dyslexia, ADHD, autism, mental health. There was still such a huge requirement for that. So this did kind of force the hand of professional bodies, test publishers, and regulators to quickly review which tests can we use in online in a safe and fair way. It sort of forced them to produce guidance on using platforms like Zoom and Teams, about screen sharing, about online consent. And it sort of forced them to collect evidence that actually remote scores were broadly matched to in-person results as well. So if that was the case, then yeah, absolutely, these tests can be reused in a remote capacity. So post-COVID, I think a lot of professionals and the sector in general recognised that remote assessment does have some real advantages. It does create better access for people with other disabilities, those who are anxious, those who have got other responsibilities like caring for children or elderly parents, those who live far away from specialist provisions those in remote locations. It meant less travel time, less time off work, less time out of education, and a lot easier perhaps to involve other individuals, like partners or employers as well in that process. So we're now in a situation where remote assessments exist because the technology is good enough. We've got more stable video, secure platforms, more digital test materials that we can use. The professional guidelines and evidence are more robust, and when they're used properly, they are just as valid and robust as an in-person assessment for many people and purposes. So they've really opened up access to dyslexia assessment services. Um, Understandably, there are concerns and there are worries, and it usually centres around the validity of the assessment. And yeah, they absolutely are. There's always lots of concerns about technology fails, and as we'll go on to see that there are sort of processes in place to address that, as well as concentration and fatigue elements of using more digitized services. So we're going to unpack some of those as we go through, and hopefully it will demonstrate what good practice looks like in a remote setup. So this is just a quick overview of the remote process, and it does look very similar to a face-to-face process, albeit apart from the secure video aspect. So there's usually an initial inquiry made. So that can be a phone call, it can be made directly through website platforms, where you can sort of express your concerns with our staff, and you may get the opportunity to talk to assessors. Our staff dealing with queries are also very experienced at dealing with referrals. So at that point in time, they'll probably check with you that a remote assessment is appropriate. And we also stick to our professional boundaries. So if one member of staff doesn't feel like they can address a specific query, we tap into each other's areas of expertise when required to ensure that you're being given the best and most accurate advice in making in that decision. So at that point, if you're unsure about a remote assessment, it might be, yes, let's talk to an assessor, and discuss some concerns. So if you decide, yeah, that's the route that I want to take, you'll be sent some background questionnaires, which will help in that initial process of generating that really in-depth background history. There'll be consent forms sent as well, and checklists to make sure that you've got the correct tech, and that in some instances we may also send you additional questionnaires if you're also querying ADHD or dyspraxia, for educational purposes, and not seeking a medical diagnosis, which I can address any queries about that later on if you wish. So the aim in that point of background questionnaires and consent is to work together to generate as much background information as possible. At that point, if you're in the workplace, it might also be that you want to involve your employer in discussions. That I've participated in that in the past and sort of taken part in a tripartite discussion with employer, individual being assessed, and myself, to build up that bank of information that's going to be really useful for that diagnostic decision and reporting and recommendations later on. But that's not for everybody. That's individual choice. Once that information is received, there will be a technology check. This can be done via a phone call just to make sure you've got the recommended things, but ideally it's done via an online platform, such as Teams, and that's just to make sure your device, your internet connection, and your environment are suitable for testing. It's also a really good opportunity to meet your assessor as well, in a more informal way, to alleviate any anxieties that you might have about the assessment, answer any queries or questions that you might have. Um, so it's a nice opportunity to get to meet one another. So the next sort of point is the assessment session or sessions, because sometimes you don't do all of the tests in one assessment session. It can be negotiated beforehand that you want to split that up. It might also just occur on the day that there might be several scenarios that mean that assessment needs to cease and take place on another day, which is absolutely fine. Um, so it's held on a secure video platform, and depending on the tests that the assessor chooses, you might also be sent some paper-based resources to use during the assessment. So that is again down to the assessor and the individual that's being assessed. So, for example, some assessors might use a particular test where the booklet for a reading test needs to be paper based. So that will be sent out to you, and there'll be instructions about what to do with that at a later point, which will either be you destroy the booklet or you post it back, and we provide the resources for you to do so. Um, those kind of things will be outlined in that tech check as well. The assessor will make sure that you fully understand what's going to happen when you actually turn up for your assessment. So afterwards, there's a lot of number crunching, there's a lot of synthesizing of information, and the assessor will score, interpret those results, merge it and contemplate it with observations that they've made through the recording that they may have taken of the session, which you will be alerted to, and I'll also address a little bit later on, and your background information. So it's all building up that picture to help them make their conclusion and the recommendations. So once the report is produced, which for Access to Learn, we stipulate that that's a 10-day working turnaround, a 10-day working day turnaround. You will be offered the opportunity to have feedback. Again, it's not mandatory. Everybody is very individual on this. Sometimes people want, again, to meet up and talk through the reports. Other times people just want the reports, and that's absolutely fine. It is good to talk through what the results are and to get a clear understanding of it. But again, as I say, that's an individual choice. So, just a brief summary of that process for ease. So, before their assessment, diagnostic interview, sometimes by phone or video, forms are sent out. They may request information from other individuals that know you, especially with co-occurring factors that might be related to ADHD or dyspraxia. Might be useful to have input from workplace as well at that point. During the remote session, the assessor will build in lots of movement breaks and use a mix of tasks as well as like short conversation breaks. Um, It can be quite fatiguing, as I'm sure you're all aware, just working with computers in general. So that is a real consideration, that lots of short breaks are offered at lots of different opportunities throughout the assessment. Sometimes you can have somebody nearby if you've got tech issues as well. But it's sort of mindful that that person is just there for tech issues for you, but not to help you with answering the questions. So after an assessment, you'll get your feedback with the recommendations, and that report is down to your discretion what you do with it. It's a confidential document. And again, in the next few slides, I'll talk about how that might be shared with educational institutions or workplace environments. So for adults, remote assessment, it's often a really good practical option. We're often juggling multiple responsibilities. And if you're in work, you might also be studying alongside that, as well as children or caring roles. So everybody's lives are very complex. So it offers a really practical solution to that. And the flexibility of remote delivery does make it easier to attend without taking big amounts of time off and traveling long distances. So it can often feel more accessible for people who experience fatigue, chronic pain, anxiety, sensory overwhelm when traveling, especially to unfamiliar environments. And if someone's already used to online meetings and digital tools, it's a pretty smooth transition. So before confirming a remote assessment, the assessor will check a few things. Such as any hearing or vision or communication needs that might affect remote delivery, whether you can maintain attention online during structured tasks. Sometimes these are particularly relevant to younger children when thinking about remote assessments, but there is also a consideration for adults as well. Um, is there a quiet private space available for the session? And will that remote administration allow for valid and reliable tests for that particular individual? Because if those other things aren't addressed, then it could affect test results. Um, so there are obviously situations where remote assessment is not the best fit, and we'll look at those shortly. But especially for those who are balancing busy lives and managing other health related barriers, um, remote assessment is is really it's really suitable and accessible, and it reduces disruption. So it's often a really sort of appealing option. So for those in further education, higher education, remote assessment offers, that really good fit. It reduces things like travel, fitting things around lectures and placements and other responsibilities. Um, it's much more manageable for people if you live away from assessment centres, and it just makes it more accessible. So in terms of outcomes used, the outcomes of an assessment for students in higher education is the disabled students' allowances. And if there are any other signs of ADHD or dyspraxia, an assessor can't diagnose those, but will signpost onto other routes. So a good report will link the cognitive profile from tests to practical recommendations for studying in that context and exams. So specifically workplace, which I think is the big focus this afternoon. Remote assessments definitely slot more naturally into how people are already possibly working, with a much more hybrid or remote working format, being the norm for a lot of people these days. So the assessment will focus on job tasks. So things like reading volumes of emails, report writing, time management, different paperwork systems. You often have to learn new software in certain environments. It can often be quite fast paced, things like ad hoc meetings and fast paced meetings going on. So, discussions about what's actually involved in your job role are really integral to an assessment based on gaining more reasonable adjustments from the workplace. So a report will translate that profile into those reasonable adjustments. So, for example, adjustments to the written information that you receive in your work environment, the use of particular assistive technology for certain tasks, adaptations to how tasks are allocated, and deadlines and how things are communicated to you. There might also be recommendations related to strategy coaching or training, which has got parallels with the one-to-one study skills that you might experience in a higher education environment. Um, and it's useful as part of conversations with managers and HR, or when you might contemplate engaging in the access to work application process. Um, so if you were contemplating getting an assessment completed for the purposes of access to work, a dyslexia assessment can be helpful for that process. It provides clear, structured evidence that supports your application and helps an access to work advisor understand what you need. I'm not sure if anybody has an experience of an access to work application. I do, and I think it's clear that access to work advisors aren't specialists. So a report such as a dyslexia diagnostic report is definitely a useful tool which may ease the way for you in that application process. You don't necessarily have to have a diagnosis either, which is an important point to make for access to work. But I think that more and more, because awareness of access to work is increasing, evidence is being asked for. I've been asked for evidence of my disabilities, and I wasn't anticipating that that would be the case, but I was asked for it, so I provided it. Um, so it's just to make you aware you don't necessarily need a diagnosis, but I think the norm with access to work advisors is that they are now asking for that. And I do feel like a report strengthens an application significantly because they are not the specialists at all. Um, your report would explain the nature of your difficulties, and it would assist you in helping explain those as well. Um, and where the challenges appear in your everyday job and the tasks that you're involved in, and importantly, what kinds of supports are going to make the difference and allow you to meet your potential at work. So a good report for the workplace will outline your strengths. It will pinpoint the dyslexic challenges that you experience. It'll link these directly to the types of tasks that you do at work, for things that I've mentioned, such as large volumes of information having to be processed, the report writing, the time management, meeting deadlines, taking notes, learning new processes and new systems. So and a good report will recommend reasonable adjustments, such as changes to materials, different practices, training and awareness for staff, workload, organisation, assistive technology. And assistive technology is progressing so rapidly. to which is really positive. So things like text to speech mind mapping tools, speech recognition software, note taking supports, and then the in-person support, the strategy coaching, which Access to Work will frequently fund, and that helps individuals build confidence and develop more personalised working methods. Um, so all of this gives Access to Work assessors just a clear picture of what support will allow you to perform at your best, as well as assisting your employer in understanding what your needs are in a really constructive and practical way. And it just makes those adjustments, those discussions about adjustments, easier. Um, so, what if you wanted adjustments, but you didn't want to go through the Access to Work process? Because sometimes that is a consideration if the cost implications are very low. Organisations may just put adjustments in place. And you don't necessarily need to go through that process. So the same principle applies. The assessment is extremely valuable in the workplace, if Access to Work isn't involved. It does give you a clear blueprint for understanding what an employee's needs are, what reasonable adjustments, what's proportionate as well. It gives a detailed picture of cognitive strengths and challenges, examples of how challenges might show up in everyday work tasks. Um, it helps employers understand not just what someone is finding challenging, but why they're finding that challenging, and therefore what's going to help. Excuse me. Um, it might also highlight specific aspects of the job that are most affected, such as reading large amounts of text quickly. And I think these days there is such an expectation because we use technology so much that that process can be done quickly, but that's not necessarily the case for everybody. Um, so another aspect of that is proofreading for accuracy, um, re producing and writing things under the time pressure, the organisation of work tasks and managing that, as well as the large amount of verbal instructions that can go on in online meetings, in face-to-face contexts. Work environments are very diverse and complex, so it's useful for sort of highlighting those areas that might pose a particular challenge. So again, a good report would translate all of that into really specific and practical recommendations. So again, it's all about shifting and adapting what and how information is presented, making tweaks to deadlines, making tweaks to the expectations of output for an individual, presenting information in multiple formats, allowing different methods of communication or completing tasks, definitely harnessing assistive tech. And because the assessments are carried out by specialists, the recommendations come with that professional rationale as well, which gives employers a confidence that the adjustments that are being recommended are actually appropriate and proportionate. And again, a report does provide sort of a shared language for conversations about support needs. It can make that discussion between an employee and a manager much more open and positive and constructive, and actually reduce a lot of misunderstandings. So it can support well-being, and increase and sustain job performance. I've often seen that is the case, that before an employer is even aware of an employee's disabilities, there's conflicts, there's queries as to why some things aren't being done or aren't being done on time or are full of mistakes. And once all these discussions have taken place and adjustments are implemented, the relationship and the understanding is much better and much more positive. Um, so even without access to work, a dyslexia assessment, remote or face-to-face, can support adjustments that help people work more effectively, reduce stress and fatigue, and actually make you feel more confident in your role and meet that potential. So obviously technology and the environment are a big part of making remote assessment successful. So there is a lot of emphasis on this before you actually engage in the test process. So you do get sent a checklist from Access to Learn. We will send you a checklist of requirements. So having a laptop or a desktop, not a phone. We are bound by some test requirements that devices do have to be of a particular size when you're doing remote assessments. So a laptop or a desktop computer generally meet those requirements. But if there are any concerns, then that can be discussed. And if you don't have access to that and you do want a remote assessment, then that can be a discussion that we can have to see if we can facilitate a solution to that, because there are often lots of solutions to the tech issues. The stable internet connection and the quiet space where you not to be interrupted. So just going back to the tech check, there'll be that call to make sure everything works, that you're comfortable with the platform, that you can adjust your camera so the assessor can see you if you're writing on particular tasks, that you can share your screen in some instances for specific tests. So we just make sure that you're comfortable with those things that will be involved in the test. And it's not just a surprise on the day that you've got to do that. So we'll also go through safeguarding procedures as well, and things about your data and how it's stored and shared. Whether the session will be recorded. So a lot of assessors will record the session, and we'll tell you why we're recording it and for how long it's kept. Some assessors are quite proficient at administering tests and observing remotely. Personally, I record because I find it quite fatiguing. So I don't want to miss out on any observation that's really important for the report, because lots of things happen that help build up that picture in that diagnostic process. Um, the recordings aren't kept after a report is provided. They're deleted once a diagnostic report is provided to an individual. Um, and there's a backup plan if tech fails, and that might be it's just got to be rescheduled. We might have to switch to a different platform, so using Zoom instead of Teams. And yeah, if technology isn't cooperating on the day, then it is maybe rebooking it on another day, in maybe in a different location. I know some people prefer to do remote assessments in the work environment where their connections are more stable, but that's not an option for everybody, so they'll opt for home or try and find an environment themselves that is better for them. So in this slide, it is worth pointing out that a remote assessment is not automatically suitable for everybody. And I suppose we want to find out that information initially, right at the beginning of the process. So if there's any safeguarding concerns, it won't go ahead remotely. And that might include not being sure that an individual understands the process, not having parental consent for children is one, and noticing signs that someone might not be safe in their environment or they're under pressure from someone else in that environment. Um, Secondly, remote assessment relies on you being in a private, quiet space. And if other people are constantly coming in and out, if there's obvious prompting off camera, or if the environment is really distracting and it's affecting performance, then that means the results aren't going to be meaningful. So an assessment might cease in that example. Um, and technology has to work well enough to support the tests. If the connection keeps dropping, if the video's distorted or the audio is distorted, there are certain things we can do and repeat. But if it's consistent and it's starting to affect the test, um, then it's resulting in not a fair and valid assessment. So it would not be appropriate to continue in that example. And like I said, it would be rearranged. Um, there might be situations where someone's profile is actually much more complex. There might be other difficulties that are affecting engagement in a remote platform. So in those cases, um, it might be a case that remote isn't the correct tool and in person is much more appropriate. But that kind of element would hopefully be addressed before you got to the point of doing tests. It would be discussed initially at the outset in that process. Um, and Again, it's about being confident about test security and identity. So, if I've never experienced this, but it could potentially occur if someone else is doing the task. So we do check identity of individuals as well, which is on a checklist of things for individuals, um, and paying attention to how somebody feels about particular formats. If someone is clearly struggling with a remote assessment, then a face-to-face one is more realistic. So that would be discussed. If it's not appropriate, assessments will be paused, explained why. So it could be all of those things that I've mentioned. And if the remote format isn't suitable, then it would be suggesting an in-person assessment and trying to facilitate that. As an organisation, we have assessors all over the country, so that would be something we could facilitate. Um, Sometimes the next step is a referral instead of a dyslexia assessment in complex cases. So it might be that vision or hearing needs to be addressed before the assessment takes place. And of course, that should be addressed before we get to that point of carrying out the assessment. And it would be if there are any concerns over vision or hearing, for example, they would be addressed before the assessment. And this is all documented in that report as well. So it makes sure that the future assessment is safe, it's ethical, and gives a fair picture of strengths and challenges, rather than forcing a remote process that's not appropriate. So, some frequently asked questions. I think I'm running out of time. Um, so, is a remote assessment as valid? Yes, it is when it's done properly and with the right person. So, um, the assessors, what matters most is the assessor is qualified and experienced, that it's appropriate for the individual, that you're using an assessor is using tests that they are permitted to use in a remote context. So yes, it's absolutely as valid as an in-person one. Um, there are often concerns about failing an assessment, but it's not a pass or a fail. Its purpose is to understand how someone processes written language, to understand where things are feeling harder than expected, understanding what support and strategies are going to be beneficial, understanding um, whether or not the outcome is actually dyslexia. Um, will having dyslexia in writing limit me for further opportunities? So I've put label in inverted commas for a reason. It is actually a concern that many higher education students I've worked with in the past have expressed that when they apply for jobs, is it going to be limiting? And more often than not, it actually is a positive thing. It helps rather than hinders, because of all those reasons that I've discussed earlier. That it allows reasonable adjustments, allows potential to be met, can support applications for funding such as Access to Work, helps your employer understand your needs, and of course you're in control of that decision, of who knows about your diagnosis or not, or who sees your reports or not. Um, some individuals ask, what if the results don't seem to match how things actually feel day to day? And that comes about when individuals actually perform very well on assessments, but that's not matching their reality of what they're experiencing every day. And a good assessor considers that lived experience. They will be observant about how much effort it takes in tasks, and they will consider that. They'll look at the coping strategies you've developed over time. They'll look at how these difficulties show up in the real world. And if something doesn't feel right, during your feedback, you challenge that and you ask questions about that to get clarification. Um, who will see the report? So it's only the people you choose to share it with, and you don't have to share all of the reports. A lot of people will choose just to share the practical recommendations at the back of the report, or some people just might share the diagnostic decision and at the front of the report and the recommendations at the back of it, because obviously this is a confidential document where data protection rules apply. And we're very clear about that at the outset, that that's your confidential documentation and you share what information you want out of that. So there's a lot of personal information that goes into these reports. If you're uncomfortable with specific information being in that report, then it doesn't go in that report. So all of those discussions can take place with your assessor. And the key one, are remote assessments cheaper? They are with us, with Access to Learn. It's not the case with all assessors. Everybody approaches it differently. But because of the reduced amount of resources that need to be paid for, the remote assessments are often a cheaper option. But again, you've got to consider, just because it is cheaper, does that make it the best option for me? Is face to face better? So it's weighing up those pros and cons. Um, so some practical pointers for and assessments in general, but definitely for remote. Real life examples are beneficial for that process, so that an assessor can make those links between what they're observing in the tests and the challenges that that present in the workplace. If you've got any previous reports, any previous exam access information, that's really good to provide as well. Really plan your time so you're not rushing in and out or having to attend a meeting before you do your assessment or after you do your assessment. Definitely test your tech the day before. Microsoft, I think, updates on a daily basis recently. So it's always worth making sure everything's updated. And glasses and coloured overlays, definitely key things to remember. We do send checklists out as reminders as well. There are key things to help you remember those things. So, just a bit of a summary. Dyslexia assessments are as robust and valid and accessible as face to face. Your suitability will depend on who you are, what your needs are, your environment, and your tech. The process is the same as face to face. So, gathering the history, doing the tests, interpreting it, reporting and feedback. And like with face to face, preparation is key. And if you do have any questions, even if you think the challenging questions, it's good to ask those questions. That's what we're there for. So I suppose at the end of this, you just got to reflect: is a remote assessment the right thing for me or the person I'm supporting? And if you do want any more information, then the contact details are there on the slide. I'll just leave that on. And that's me. I didn't think I was going to talk for an hour. Sorry.
No, great. Thank you so much, Rachel. Oh, there we go. We do have a question, and if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to put that in the chat box as well, since we have a couple more minutes. Um, will you talk about how much it costs? I believe you mentioned that. I believe you touched on this, but this is just a question that we had come in.
Oh, so the costs of assessments are on the Access to Learn website, and there is a difference between remote and face to face, and there are also other things to consider as well because we do offer assessments that focus on ADHD traits and dyspraxia traits as well. So often sometimes people think or are aware, yes, I have traits of ADHD and would like to be considered for that. And those reports which involve dyslexia and, for example, ADHD, the specialists at Access to Learn, we're qualified to do those reports for educational and access to work purposes. If you wanted a medical diagnosis of ADHD, we would refer you to our NeuroElevate clinicians. Um, and there is a slight increase in cost for those assessments. But off the top of my head, and I knew I was going to get asked this, the cost, the specifics of it, I don't know, but they are on the website. But remote is definitely cheaper.
Yeah, Eve just put in the chat actually the link to the website where you can find the pricing, and a remote dyslexia assessment for people older than 16 is £395 plus VAT.
Brilliant.
Great. I don't know if there's any other questions. And actually, for everyone, the recording will be available online, and the FAQs that you shared with me, I sent in the chat as well. So if you want to download that, that is there, and that answers so many questions. I
Yeah.
think that was. I was trying to think of some other questions while you were presenting, but I think you gave such an informative thing. Thank you very much for the webinar. We had that in the chat box come in. Thank you for attending. Um, yeah, so you all have the contact information if any other questions come up. I want to thank you again, Rachel, for giving such an informative session and for also providing the FAQ sheet. I think that will be really helpful for anyone who has any questions come up. And also, if you're sharing this information with someone else, that's very informative.
Brilliant.
Great. Well, without further ado, I will end this a little bit earlier. Thank you, John. Thank you for coming. Um, And hope everyone has a great weekend. And I'm going to work to get this recording up over the weekend, probably. Oh, this is Thursday, but we usually have our webinars on Friday. So early start to the weekend, and I'll hope to get this webinar up by tomorrow.
All right. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone
Bye.
for
Bye.
coming.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.